Okay, hey everyone. Welcome to the Contour community meeting. Today is Tuesday, July 27th, 2021. If you're here, please add your name to the design or the HackMD, which I can paste here in the chat as well. So we're going to get started on the community meeting for today. We have a couple things in here, and then feel free to add whatever you want to the status or discussion topics. So first thing up, I think, is our Contour 1.17.1. Anyone want to cover what that entails? If not, I can. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do it. So there was a CVE found in Kubernetes, which has essentially, with external name type services, those allow you to specify any DNS name that you'd want to in that service. So essentially, you can circumvent security that within a namespace by creating an external name and then sending it to another, like, service dot namespace whatever, so you can send traffic to a different service in a different namespace without having direct access to it, I guess. So it's sort of like a CV to me. So it's sort of like, I thought we all kind of knew that, but I guess you could do malicious things with that or bad things with that. Specifically with Contour, what you can do is you can actually make an external name of type localhost. And with that, you can get to the local Envoy admin webpage. And by doing that, you can actually, shut down Envoy, tell it to go unhealthy, do all kinds of nasty things. So if you had enough permissions to create an external name, and you can essentially take down someone's Envoy fleet this way, if you could, have access to the cluster. So what we did with Contour was we added a new flag, and that's this a new config item, and that's this enable external service true. And what that does is, by default, this is off. So if you upgrade to 1.17.1, this will have this set to false so that you can't use external name services. And that basically disables this way of having the CVE become apparent. If you want external names, you can still enable it with true. But what that does is then puts you back in a spot where folks could exploit this little thing. So going forward, I think the idea what we thought of having was creating like an allow list or something of external names. And then you could define, hey, because if you needed to use external names, but you didn't want to have the CV, you could still allow an allow list possibly. And this still won't hide you from the problem, right? Because someone could still make a DNS entry and change it to point to localhost and get back to it. But at least they'd be, a limited set of DNS entries that maybe you own or control. So that's this one. If you don't use external names, then this shouldn't be a problem. But if you have external names, then this could be an issue, and then could break you as well if you're not familiar with this. So that's all. So that's that one. We did release it here. It has a full CVE. I forget the ID number. It's down here. Yeah, this 2021 32 783. So that's number 2. So that's the reason for that. And I think this week we're going to have a 1.18 to follow up to this, which was this one. And we want to talk about that. I'm not sure if we know all the bits and bobs. Sanjay, do you have an idea of what's in that release?
Yeah, I think so. For the operator, it should fix some things related to Gateway API. I think that was just kind of generally broken in the 1.17 release. So if you're using the operator, you should actually be able to use it with Gateway API now. In 1.18, what else is in that? I think there's a couple other, there's obviously the CVE fix is going to come out in that version as well. Let's take a look at some of the other commits that we've got going on here. The ability to add a little bit more configurability to the access log format. That's another interesting little feature that was just merged. Some more, I think Steve K worked on something to add an Ingress class name field to the HTTP proxy, in addition to being able to filter on the annotation. You can use a field that's in the HTTP proxy the object as well. And other than that, not too much in here in 118. So a little bit smaller release, I think, than previous. But we'll have a full set of changes available in the release notes with the release. It should be a little bit smaller than previous ones.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah, I think this next the big thing is we're going to fix up the Gateway API stuff with the operator and such. And then related to that, this is sort of an issue I know that we've been chatting about that we probably should talk about at some point. But there's talk of moving Contour from a monthly release to a quarterly release. And this is for a number of different reasons. One is just to allow more time to get more features into releases. And then two is to allow not force users into upgrading as fast as every month. So we thought Kubernetes was pretty fast, and this is even faster than that. So this is a discussion topic. If folks are interested, please go comment on this. But if we do this, then that means that the next release 1.19 won't happen for what, 3 months? Or we'll do it, was it in October and then we'll start it? Is that what the idea?
Yeah, I think we talked about, so 1.18 is going to come out in a couple of days. Then we talked about doing 1.19 probably in about 6 weeks. So kind of an elongated release cycle, but not quite 3 months yet. And then 1.20 would be would be another 6 weeks after that. And that would be kind of the start of the quarterly cycle.
Yeah. So nothing really changing here in terms of us building things. It's just sort of like, we're just going to space them out a little further. So cool. So that'll help, I think, with a lot of these things. And we're going to have lots of new changes with some of this gateway operator kind of merging work that we're talking about. I think we brought this up in the past, but there's a design doc that we've been working on to help kind of move some of the functionality from the operator into Contour. And there's a million different reasons why we're doing that and kind of things that we're going to try and solve. But the long and short is that this will all still work. So I'll still work the same way you're used to it in the sense that if you want an operator type deployment, you can do that. If you don't want an operator style deployment, you can still manage it with YAML or YTT or whatever type of Kubernetes application management style you'd want to, whether it's GitOps or whatever. So it's a layered approach, right? So you can apply what you'd like. So right now I'm converting this design doc back into Markdown. Because we had it in GitHub, and it's sort of hard to have a group conversation in GitHub sometimes. I guess things get lost very easily. So we moved the discussion to here, and then we're going to put it back into there for posterity in the repo. So this explains kind of the ins and outs of what we're going to do, how we're going to do it in a sense. And then I think from this, there's going to be a bunch more designs that will outline various features and functionality for all these different components and stuff. So yeah, this is a good one to check out. Again, I'm moving that now, so that'll be there. Any other status things before we get to this discussion topic? Cool. So in this design doc, we had one more open issue that I wanted to kind of chat about if we had time. I think we've got time. So this is actually from you, Steve. You brought this up. Where was it? It was down here about what ports do we define? So in a gateway, bring up the spec. Nice spec, gateway. So gateway has a set of listeners, right? And each listener defines how traffic gets into the gateway. For Contour, since we're a layer 7 proxy, typically what we're going to have is an insecure port and a secure port. So ports 80 and 443. And that's this port down here. Now the question came up, and it's a great question, is there's sort of like this idea of a public port, which clients external to the cluster use to talk to the controller. And there's an internal port number, which Envoy uses, right? So typically when we deploy it, we'll have Contour listen on 8443. I guess should be in here, right?
Yeah, if you want to open up that drawing link, it has some of that.
Oh, do you have that? Okay.
Together, next to each other.
Yeah, so here's a good example, and then I'll pop your link open since I'm here. So we have the container port. So Envoy listens on port 8080, and then then the public port is port 80. Same thing for the secure port. So there's this idea of having two different ports you've got to think about.
Yeah, so the 8080 and 8443 end up being the endpoints for the Envoy service that ends up showing up in Kubernetes.
Mhm.
So the port 80, the host port, it's another thing there that we have to worry about. But yeah, there's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ports involved, right? There's the service that exposes Envoy, the port that it exposes. There's the node port that, or if you're using a load balancer service, there's a node port that Kubernetes will populate for you. There's the target port for that, which is okay. I'll continue to the other two. So then there's the host port for the Envoy daemon set, and then there's the container port, which is actually like what Envoy listens on. We also configure Envoy to listen on that port, and that's the pod. Like to send traffic to that pod, you would use the pod IP and the container port, right? So I guess what I was thinking about when I was looking at this is like, okay, we typically use service of type load balancer to, I can give you edit access to if you want to add more drawing.
No, I was just trying to make it a little bigger. That's all. Yeah, go ahead.
But we typically use a load balancer service to expose Envoy, but not necessarily, everyone won't necessarily want to do that. So there's that to consider when we're talking about these ports as well. And if we make a decision with the gateway API, like what the listener port means, it has to be something that gracefully kind of works with various deployment styles as well.
Right. Because today we configure these target ports. This is what Envoy listens to, are flags on Contour that we set. So there's two different flags, the default to 8080 and 8443. You can override that and change that. But then this port 80 translation to 8080 is done in this service, which is just a convention thing that you deploy the YAMLs, you get that for free. So,
and doesn't it kind of matter like how the load balancer is implemented too? Because you could have it implemented so that it's routing directly to a pod, or it has to go through the NAT hop of the worker to the pod. So the target port and the node port kind of are interesting depending on how you have your load balancer actually implemented, right?
Yeah.
So the gateway API is saying, okay, there's one port for a listener. It is a little bit confusing as to what we should, in all these different scenarios, what we should have that mean.
See, initially, I was thinking that the port that Envoy listens on is this target port. That's what you configure here. And that's what matches the gateway. And then the gateway you spin up to expose Envoy to the world, that port would then be 80, right? Because essentially this matches your load balancer idea. So this 80 and 443 is your gateway load balancer. And then
you can change the target port in a kind cluster, you can change the target port to something random and it's still everything still works on the
right,
because it's not necessarily routing through directly to the pod IP. It might be going through the worker and then natting to the pod.
So it seems like for us, this port is the gateway port on the service. Does that seem fair or no?
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking about this in the context, Steve, of, you had the idea of using multiple gateways. to kind of represent exactly how this traffic flows. So there's like the internal gateway that just represents like once traffic's in the cluster, how it gets into the Envoy service.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then there's like the external gateway, which roughly corresponds to a service of type load balancer, which represents like how traffic gets into the cluster to begin with. And so like, if you had those two gateways, then I could see that you know, for the external one, like the listener ports could be 80 and 443. And then for the internal one, it might make sense for them to be 8080 and 8443. But if we're only, you know, if that's kind of a future idea and we're not implementing that yet, and we just have one gateway that represents kind of that whole thing,
Mhm.
then yeah, to me, I mean, I think in that scenario, the external ports should be the ones that the gateway specifies, right? Because from the user perspective, that's where their traffic is getting directed to. Yeah, that's what they interact with. And then like 8080 and 8443 are really just implementation details from a user perspective.
Right. I mean, no one really cares what these are, right? Like you said, Sanjay, you can change this to whatever you want, as long as Envoy is listening on the right one.
Oh yeah, because well, 8080, you can actually change that to, you can have all the rest of the config that's there in this file, and with a certain implementation of load balancer, that target port doesn't matter,
Right.
Like, so it could be 5, and it's like 8089 and 8449, and Envoy could still be listening on 8080 and 8443, and it's not actually using that to route to Envoy.
But this port is important, right? It's going to use service type load balancer. It's going to use this port to become the public port on the load balancer.
Yeah.
So if you made this one like 8080, then you're going to have an ELB. Say in AWS, you're going to have an ELB with 8080 as the port.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
So do we want to implement, like, I think what Steve K brings up with your idea, Steve S, is like, it makes sense to have two levels of things. Like, would it make sense for us to say, okay, gateway API first pass, like you configure where Envoy listens, but you also still have to make a load balancer service yourself, because we don't know how you want to get traffic into the cluster? Or does it not make sense to do that? And then in the future, you can say, okay, you can make this different type of gateway. Maybe it's with a different gateway class that will implement, like, related to your other controller idea, where either Contour or some other component would, and maybe eventually a cloud provider would say, okay, I'm going to turn a different kind of gateway into an actual cloud load balancer.
Yeah. I think when gateway API is like, production ready and finalized, you wouldn't use service type load balancer. You would use the gateway.
Yeah.
A new gateway to get traffic to Envoy, right? Because that's how you're going to expose stuff to the world.
Because
So,
are we
yeah.
when we're implementing a listener on a gateway,
Mhm.
are we actually implementing? We're not actually trying to implement how traffic gets out from outside of the cluster inside the cluster, right?
No, not with the Contour gateway. No. Unless you had host ports, I guess.
Yeah,
right.
unless you expose. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
if it was
go ahead.
host networking or host port, yeah, then I think it would. Then that port 80 is port 80 everywhere. But no, I think from a Contour perspective, it doesn't really care how the traffic gets to Envoy. It's always more of like, that's off. That's a black box over there. Like that needs to happen. So make that happen over there,
Yeah. It's tied up in our deployment, an example that we have, because otherwise it doesn't really like do anything, right? Because you have to get traffic from outside the cluster into the cluster. But theoretically, we could say, okay, here you have Contour, but have all sorts of different options for, like, don't provide in the example YAML, don't provide the load balancer service,
right.
but
Mhm.
provide many different examples that like, okay, if you want to use load balancer, use this. If you want to do no port, if you want to do different pod routing, use this.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
speak here. I think you're.
yeah, go ahead,
Sorry,
Steve.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think with the design for the managed Envoy though, like Contour would be programming those things, right? Like Contour would be creating the service of type load balancer, or potentially down the road creating the gateway and setting the ports. So
Yeah.
like today, it's it's just something that's manifested in our example YAML, but Contour core doesn't really care how the traffic gets in. But if we're managing Envoy, then like we are, Contour is instantiating those things, and so it does need to care about it.
Yeah, and that's why I was trying to, in a sense, not have us program all of that back into Contour. That's essentially this. This is what the operator does. This is that network, the Envoy network publishing struct, and this is how the operator defines, what type of service is it, load balancer, cluster IP, etc. Which provider is it? AWS, Google, Azure, whatever the provider is, and then all these little bits and bobs you've got to configure. But see, here's a container port thing. So this is how the operator solves it by.
It just gives you all of the knobs. But
Yeah.
do we have enough information with a single gateway and however many listeners? If Contour sees that, does it have enough information to make the Envoy daemon set or deployment, whatever, and also make the thing that exposes that outside the cluster?
To me, the tricky part is if you added like a third listener, what happens?
Yeah.
Right, because Contour today only knows about 2 ports, insecure. That's all it knows about. So if we added a third one, which gateway lets you do that, you can have as many as you want in this list, this set. What happens then, right? Do we add a list of ports that you can attach to, or do you just make them managed by Contour? So this private target port, does anyone really care what that port is? I don't know.
Right.
And then future, I have ideas that we could exploit these listeners and have multiple gateways running out of a single Contour. Right. So you could have like this service pointing to 80 and 8443, and then have 2 more listeners on like 8081 and 8444, which could be a different gateway. Right. So if you had 2 services pointing to these different ports on Envoy, you essentially get multiple gateways from the same Contour instance. And it's the same processing logic that we have today. It's just you got to add the listener bits to it. So, but again, that's super future, but it's still sort of interesting to figure out now. So we're set up the right way to go to that,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's hard because we're not an external gateway in a sense. We're a cluster gateway. We're not a, if we were implementing this for like a Google load balancer or an Azure load balancer or something.
That's much easier to implement because it's just like, okay, traffic here to here, right?
Right.
Select the pods or whatever that or worker nodes that you need to send this traffic to and get the IPs and ports, and probably pretty easy. But
yeah, because in one sense, to me, the listeners on the gateway should match to these target ports in a sense, right? Here's what Envoy is listening on, because that's what traffic is getting sent to. And then the external load balancer, the external gateway, which defines how traffic gets to that port, says, oh, I'm mapping port 80 to 8443. How that mapping happens, I don't know. It's a good question too. If this was an external one, this was your Google load balancer, you've got port 80, but what tells port 80 to map to port? I guess it'd be the TCP route then. That would do it. Yeah. That's what would do it. So your gateway would listen on port 80. You'd have a TCP route, which would map to port 8080 on those Envoy pods. That's how you would do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do sort of like that model. Like it's, everything's kind of explicit and it maps well to gateway API concepts.
Yeah. But if you don't have
Cool.
Gateway API, that's the tricky part. That's why I was going on that path of saying, let's just put it in there anyway, even if you're not using it, and use those constructs to be the way to expose stuff out to the cluster. But I don't know. Because if you don't do that, then you've got to bake all this into like the operator did. And then it's in two different places, and it's kind of weird then, because you could do it this way or this way, and which way is the right way depending on your context. So it's confusing, I guess. So yeah, let's think about this, have some more chats. I think we're at time here. I don't want to drag this on any longer. Ame's here. Hey Ame, sorry I didn't say hi earlier.
Hey, just catching up on things.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah, nothing else to share, but in general, yeah, I think I'll have some time, so I'm just catching up on things.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, it's good to see you again. Here in the chat,
I'll probably pick up where I left off with the ALS design doc and
Okay.
address comments and move it forward. Hopefully, we'll see.
Awesome, fantastic. Yeah, looking forward to that. Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Appreciate
and
it.
feel free to reopen. I think maybe some of your PRs or issues might have been closed by the bot as stale, but feel free to just reopen them and pick up.
Sure. Cool. Thank you.
All right, cool. So I think for here we will call it. Unless someone has anything else to add. That's all. So take care. We'll see you all. I said that 1.18 should come out this week, and then we'll be in touch next week chatting about that release and then the future with 1.19. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you online.
Bye.